Today I'm going to do something different. My original goal for this video series was to choose 10 items from the academic literature on the subject of human trafficking, and to share my notes and findings on those items. But having come across a statement that there are law enforcement authorities complicit in human trafficking, I decided that this issue needed to be addressed immediately. I've been reading about the subject of human trafficking long before I started working on this video series, and this is not the first time I have come across statements that there are authorities complicit in human trafficking. In fact, that is one of the major reasons that I decided to attempt to communicate my findings publicly. What I had originally set out to do was to start with a review of the academic literature, preferably from peer-reviewed publications, in an attempt to ground the discussion as much as possible in conservative statements, factual information, peer-reviewed information, and to utilize some reticence in the hopes that we could avoid the difficulties associated with analysis of implications that could lead to irresponsible speculation. I was hoping to establish a base or a foundation, as it were, before attempting to discuss such a difficult aspect of the topic, the complicity of authorities. But this aspect of the topic is well established. It appears in the literature on the topic. It has come out in the mainstream media, as well as statements from government authorities. Therefore, I feel I do not need to build up to the topic, and the gravity of this truth demands that it be addressed. In 1997, the U.S. government estimated that between 700,000 to 2 million people per year were being trafficked across international borders. The majority of data collected for that estimate focused on the victims of sex trafficking of women and children. The 2020 TIP report, that stands for Trafficking in Persons, the 2020 TIP report stated that at any given time, 24 million people are victims of exploitations related to human trafficking, and this includes things like forced labor, slavery, practices that are similar to slavery, prostitution, sexual slavery, and organ harvesting. The average lifespan of a victim of trafficking from the time that they're trafficked is about 7 to 8 years, which means that a steady supply would be required to reach such staggering numbers as 24 million. Profits off of human trafficking in persons has exceeded the illegal arms trade and is only exceeded by the illegal drug trade. What we know about these other forms of underworld crime, arms and drug trafficking, is that profits and trade can only reach such levels when banks are complicit in money laundering for underworld criminals, and when you have police officers, judges, politicians, political leadership, border agents, FBI and intelligence services, that there would need to be people in these various fields that are compromised, either through bribery, blackmail, or participation, for the trade to reach such astounding levels of profits and also the numbers that are trafficked. There have been documentaries that have been done on this that showed that the FBI and the intelligence services were aware of the fact that there were banks that were complicit in money laundering for drug cartels. So comparing to what we know about the drug trade, we can see that when you have the numbers occurring at such a high level, the profits being so high, that there would have to be similar parallels in this case. So the implications of this realization are difficult to understand and quite possibly requires a major transformation of consciousness about the nature of our society. To borrow words from Eric Weinstein discussing the discoveries and communications to the public of the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell criminal investigations that revealed a massive blackmail scheme centered on child sex trafficking, we tripped over some enormous structure. There are many cases and reports we could discuss. This is not the first time that this has come out into public awareness. It's the most recent time that I can think of in living memory of the case that we have, but it's definitely not the first time that this has this topic has been broached and has reached out into public awareness. So there are many cases reports we could discuss, but even just looking at the Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell case, we find that Jeffrey Epstein was a known child sex trafficker, and even after being indicted in the early 2000s, justice was obstructed. He was given a slap on the wrist in the first sentencing. He got 18 months and he was released 5 months early. He was given rights and privileges to leave jail with minimal monitoring, including that he was allowed to go to work 6 days a week for 12 hours a day outside of jail. And he never once checked in with the NYPD, in spite of the fact that on paper he was required to do so every 90 days to verify his address. Many of his high-profile associates, financial, social, academic, political, business contacts, they continued doing business and collaborating with him and praising him in glossy magazines, newspapers. Given the very high-profile status of his contacts, including politicians, academicians, European royalty, business moguls, philanthropists, heads of state, finance professionals, many of whom were willing to look the other way from his atrocious criminal operation, his unknown source of wealth, which included multiple private jet aircraft, private properties in Manhattan, New Mexico, and a private island in the Caribbean. This all begs the question of what kind of structure was supporting and protecting him for close to 3 decades. Again, as the reporting of this story was communicated to the public, I returned to the words of Eric Weinstein. We tripped over some enormous structure. If you haven't looked into this case, you need to look into this. The information that has come out, the implications of it is massive. Okay, I'm going to move on to discuss some information I took notes on from the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime. On their website, they have reports that they've published and information to look at, and I took some notes on a summary of their global report on trafficking in persons. Based on data gathered from 155 countries, it offers the first global assessment of the scope of human trafficking and what is being done to fight it. It includes an overview of trafficking patterns, legal steps taken in response, and country-specific information on reported cases of trafficking persons, victims, and prosecutions. At the launch of the report in New York, the executive director of UNODC, Antonio Maria Costa, said that, quote, "Many governments are still in denial. There is even neglect when it comes to either reporting on or prosecuting cases of human trafficking," end quote. He pointed to the fact that while the number of convictions for human trafficking is increasing, 2 out of every 5 countries covered by the UNODC report had not recorded a single conviction. And there's more information on that in my first video in this series. According to the report, the most common form of human trafficking, 79%, is sexual exploitation. Victims of sexual exploitation are predominantly women and girls. Surprisingly, in 30% of the countries which provided information on the gender of the traffickers, the ones doing the trafficking, women make up the largest proportion of traffickers. In some parts of the world, women trafficking women is the norm. Second most common form of human trafficking is forced labor, 18%. Although this may be a misrepresentation because forced labor is less frequently detected and reported than trafficking for sexual exploitation. Worldwide, almost 20% of all trafficking victims are children. However, in some parts of Africa and the Mekong region, children are the majority, up to 100% in parts of West Africa. Although trafficking seems to imply people moving across continents, most exploitation takes place close to home. Data show intra-regional and domestic trafficking are the major forms of trafficking in persons. The United Nations Protocol Against Trafficking in Persons, the foremost international agreement in this area, entered into force in 2003. This report shows that in the past few years, the number of member states seriously implementing the protocol has more than doubled, from 54 to 125 out of the 155 states covered. So I guess that would be the silver lining to the information I'm communicating today. However, there are still many countries that lack the necessary legal instruments or political will. This report increases our understanding of modern slave markets, yet also our ignorance, said Mr. Costa. Quote, "We have a big picture, but it is impressionistic and lacks depth. We fear the problem is getting worse, but we cannot prove it for lack of data, and many governments are obstructing." End quote. The head of UNODC therefore called on governments and social scientists to improve information gathering and sharing on human trafficking. And again, quote, "If we do not overcome this knowledge crisis, we will be fighting the problem blindfolded," end quote, he warned. Okay, so I think that's really the point here. We need to raise public awareness. Public awareness needs to be raised to the point that this can no longer be ignored.